Segment. Dodui sent a signal into space, and something answered back. Not immediately, not clearly, but unmistakably. It wasn't part of the plan. The original transmission was simple, structured, deliberate, and entirely one way. A message designed by scientists to test the limits of communication across cosmic distances. A signal meant to travel outward, not return. This wasn't science fiction. Projects dedicated to searching for extraterrestrial intelligence have existed. For decades, radio telescopes scan the sky, listening for patterns, anything that stands out against the background noise of the universe. Occasionally, we transmit as well, carefully, rarely. Because once a signal leaves Earth, there's no controlling where it goes or who might receive it. That's where things start to break down, because the reply didn't come from where it should have. The original transmission was directed toward a specific region, one chosen for its relative proximity and the presence of potentially habitable star systems. Based on distance alone, any response would take decades, possibly centuries. But this didn't. The signal came back far too soon. At first, researchers assumed it was a reflection, radio waves bouncing off interstellar material or returning from within our own solar system. That's a known phenomenon. Signals can scatter, distort, and echo under certain conditions. But this wasn't an echo. It had structure. The returning signal wasn't identical to what was sent. It wasn't degraded in the expected way. Instead, it carried alterations, subtle changes in frequency and timing that didn't match any known form of interference. But that's not the strange part. Because when scientists isolated the differences, they realized something unsettling. The changes weren't random. They were precise, measured, almost like a response. Now, that doesn't mean it was intentional. Not necessarily. Natural processes can produce complex patterns. Pulsars, for example, emit highly regular signals. Cosmic phenomena can mimic structure. But this didn't match any known source, so they analyzed it further. They mapped the intervals between pulses, compared the modulation to the original transmission, looked for correlations, and they found them. Not perfect, not obvious, but consistent enough to raise questions, because certain elements of the original message appeared to be mirrored, adjusted. As if the signal had been received, processed, and then returned in a modified form, this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because for that to happen, something would have had to intercept the transmission. Not reflect it. Not distort it. Intercept it. That implies detection, recognition, and some form of interaction. But there's a problem with that idea. The region we targeted doesn't contain any known advanced structures, no confirmed civilizations, no detectable technology. Nothing that would explain this level of response. At least, nothing we've found. And then it got worse. A second signal appeared. Not from the same direction, not on the same frequency, but carrying a similar pattern. This one wasn't a reply to a known transmission. It wasn't linked to any outgoing message. It simply emerged. Faint, distant, but structured in a way that resembled the first. That shouldn't happen. Independent signals don't just align like that. Not across different regions of space. Not without a common source, which raises a question no one has been able to answer. If the first signal was a reply, then what is the second one? By the time the second signal was confirmed, the situation had already changed. This was no longer about a single anomaly. It was about a pattern. Two signals. Different origins, similar structure. Both appearing after a controlled transmission from Earth. At that point, researchers did what they always do. They expanded the search. Archives were reanalyzed. Old data sets, previously dismissed as noise, were pulled back into focus. Signals that had once seemed insignificant were now being re-examined under a different assumption. Not as random interference, but as potential fragments. And that's where things start to break down. Because the deeper they looked, the more they found weak signals, incomplete patterns, scattered across years of observations. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they started to align, not perfectly, but enough to suggest continuity, as if what we thought were isolated events were actually part of something larger. But that's not the strange part. Because when researchers overlaid the timing of these signals, a new detail emerged. They weren't random in time. They appeared after transmissions. Not every time. Not consistently. But often enough to raise concern. Now, correlation doesn't mean causation. That's a fundamental rule in science. Just because two events occur together doesn't mean one caused the other. But the pattern was difficult to ignore. Signals sent. Signals received. Not always, but repeatedly. This is where it gets uncomfortable. Because if these incoming signals are connected to our outgoing ones, then the implication is simple. Something is listening, not passively, actively. That doesn't mean intelligence. It doesn't mean intent, but it does mean detection. And detection changes everything, because once a signal is detected, it can be tracked, followed, located. And that introduces a level of exposure we don't fully understand, and then it got worse. A deeper analysis of the second signal revealed internal structure. Layers of modulation nested within each other. At first glance, it looked like noise stacked on top of a carrier wave. But when separated, those layers showed repeating intervals, not identical to the first signal, but related, as if both signals shared a common framework. Now, no one is claiming. These are messages, not officially, but they're not behaving like natural emissions either. Which leaves researchers in a difficult position. Either we're observing a rare, unknown astrophysical phenomenon, or we're seeing something that interacts with signals in a way we don't yet understand. Both explanations carry problems. Natural processes don't usually mirror artificial patterns, and unknown interactions raise questions we can't test, because we don't control the environment. We only observe it. That's where things start to break down again. Because attempts to replicate the event have produced inconsistent results. New transmissions were sent. Different frequencies. Different structures, different targets. Some produced no response at all. Others did, but not in the same way. The returning signals varied. Timing shifted. Patterns changed. As if whatever was responding wasn't following a fixed rule. This variability complicates everything. It removes predictability, and without predictability, there's no reliable model, which means there's no clear explanation, only possibilities. Some scientists argue that we're misinterpreting complex interference, signals bouncing, overlapping, and creating the illusion of structure. Others suggest unknown natural emitters, objects or processes we haven't yet classified. These are valid. They stay within the boundaries of known science. But they don't explain the correlation. They don't explain the mirrored elements. And they don't explain the timing, which brings us back to the core problem. We sent a signal, and something came back. Not once, but multiple times, from different directions, with related structure and no confirmed source. So the question isn't just what we received, it's what received us. Because if something out there is capable of detecting our signals, then it already knows where we are, and we still don't know what it is.